Hello, Agnes.
Hey, Robin.
Hello, guest, David Duvenaud.
Hello.
Um, I did a sequence of AI conversations sort of ad hoc over the last few weeks, but we didn't talk about that on our podcast directly with Agnes. And so this is more of an add-on event where we're going to talk about AI risk with Agnes here to help. And my major way I want to set up the framing, spending my points that I get to use to set up the framing here, is to ask you first, what did you think was going to happen under the counterfactual that somehow AI is prevented, or at least the risky forms of AI were prevented from existing? What did you think was going to be what our descendants were going to be like, and our relationship to them, and what concerns did you have about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I've watched a few of your other discussions and read your summaries, and I think I basically agree with you that the sort of default, if we don't somehow coordinate to exert a lot of control over the future, is that things continue to change, and in pretty radical ways, similar to the degree that things have changed over the last 1,000 or 10,000 years, and that we would probably think of our great grandchildren's lives as looking a little bit alien and maybe impoverished in some ways, just like someone who grew up on a farm might think from a distance, city life looks very impoverished, and why are you spending all your time looking at a small box and talking to other people through video screens? That seems very unfulfilling.
But it might be worse. First of all, rates of change have been accelerating, so we might expect these sorts of changes to happen sooner in the future compared to how fast they happened in the past. Secondly, we expect our descendants to have more ways to modify themselves, not just culturally, but they could do genetic engineering and mind control and all sorts of other things. And third, we might have extended lifespans, perhaps even immortality, in which case more older generations would overlap with new generations living in the same place and time and having conflicts directly about their differing stances. So what do you think about that world?
That's a great question. It sounds, fine as far as things go. I could imagine most of the activity being taken up by something that we don't really like maybe competition, or maybe like destructive wars, or there could be some horrible forms of extortion that become very common. I guess I don't have much to say about judgment on that future because it seems so different. And the ways that you just mentioned it might be different. I agree. It will be different in those ways, but I don't have strong judgments on it one way or another.
But to foreshadow our AI discussion, how concerned are you that we develop better forms of human mind control and cultural control so that we can make sure our human descendants don't differ in values? Maybe we should not allow children for a while until we figure out how to have children so that they would stay in our control and not differ the way past children have.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I do notice that I have this confusing sort of uncanny valley of mind control, which is that perfect mind control doesn't really bother me, right? Think of dogs. They really love serving humans. We still spay and neuter them and do all sorts of bad things to them that they don't like. But, it's certainly more palatable to me to think of some sort of dog-like creature that from birth really cares about serving humans than, say, a wolf that has a shock collar that forces it to, take care of humans even though it doesn't really want to.
And does it sound plausible to you that you could make a child who was so thoroughly mind controlled that seemed okay to you? Does that seem like a worthy descendant of yours? Would you be proud to have them be your descendants if they were so thoroughly mind controlled?
So I think that is already the case in some senses. The facts, we're built in with these desires to sort of, care about our family, and maybe just through a bunch of, not very coercive seeming processes, growing up in the same culture, our children often start off very aligned. And of course, we make a big deal about it to the extent that they aren't. And then that coercion starts to look very ugly, and refusing to let your kid date who they want or change religion or whatever seems it ends up being very costly on both sides. So again, I guess I feel yes, seems totally okay and normal to me that we do mind control our children, as long as it's in this sort of like totally successful sense where they actually, are comfortable with the values that they have, which, most beings are sort of.
Can I ask
Go
a
ahead,
question?
please.
So it seems like the thing that's striking you as bad or dangerous here is the use of coercion. Is that right?
I suppose so. I mean, I think in the large, we can think a bit more about what kind of world we want to see and what kind of actions will lead to them. And that's a different discussion. I guess I just sort of, in the small sort of like naive, immediate morality, it really seems tough when you, again, like attach a shock collar to somebody and make them do things that they don't want. However, at least I don't see a huge problem in like sort of immediately with a being that is raised to love doing a particular thing, doing that thing.
So have you ever seen the Stepford Wives?
I know, but I think I know the main plot, which is that there's these sort of robotic housewives that are made to be perfect wives, but it's somehow like a dystopia. I don't know.
There's also a famous 50s science fiction novel about aliens like putting things on people's necks that control human minds to make them obey the aliens. Have you seen that one? I'm trying to remember the name.
No.
Well, I wanted to ask you whether those seem to be sufficiently mind controlled that you like those worlds.
Okay, I guess I'll say, so perfect mind control is not enough for me to like a world. I guess I'm just trying to say, I don't find it unpalatable. Like, I don't think it's actually that bad if we imagine designing some being and to have certain values. And, you might call that brainwashing. And I guess I would say, I don't think it's problematic in the same way. I don't think it's problematic for my children to have similar values to me, whether it be through genes or, cultural transmission. And the bad part is if we sort of botch it and then we spend our whole lives just like, fighting against our kids' values because we sort of program them wrong.
But if we think about the processes that cause our values to change, right? Like trying out different kinds of arts or, exploring different things, we might think that the reasons that our values are changing is because our values are mixed up in certain ways with our experiences. So in order to, counterfactually have descendants go through similar experiences, but not have their values change, you're going to have to be fundamentally changing those processes, right? Neutering them in some sense. They're going to have to go through their lives with the sort of experiences that would have made us change our values and our attitudes, but their values and attitudes won't change. So that's a, substantive effect on their lives. When you imagine their lives with that aspect, does that seem admirable or praiseworthy?
Yeah, that's great. So I think you're getting to the heart of the matter, or you're leading me there, which is that we can't have both sort of the capacity for growth and some of the things that we think make us human, and also keep our values. And so if we did imagine some future utopia-seeming world that managed to be much richer but still have our current values, there would also be a lot of control or like, electric fences or some very invasive control, like maybe even mind control, to prevent people from updating and growing and like learning and adapting in the ways that led us to how we are today. I think that's what you're trying to.
Right. And asking you, does that look okay?
So I guess I would say there's a lot of versions of that don't look okay. And again, I have this intuition that this control is somehow a bad thing. Although to be honest, like I haven't thought deeply about what this would look like in detail. But I guess I imagine, and I'm not sure about this, and that's one thing I want to talk about, that there's a third way where our descendants really do care about keeping their traditions or values or whatever, in a way that's stronger than we did, in a way that limits their growth, but in a way that also they are happy with because it is their actual values.
And you imagine that third way, but how big a priority would you make it for us to like lock down change and stop change until we figured this thing out? Would you put trillions of dollars into a research project to try to figure this out and put all sorts of controls into preventing cultural change for the next century or two if necessary until we figure out this better form of mind control that you hope might exist?
So I guess I'm going to bite the bullet and say I do think that such a thing is plausible, and I'm considering it. And that's kind of why I want to talk to you, because it does sound insane. And every other project that has been tried in history that looks like this has led to horrible disasters and, mass killing and misery and like suffering risks, as the AGI people call it. So I think even on its face, it's very unlikely to succeed and very likely to lead to some worst of both worlds thing where we just lock in some horrible suffering for a long time and strangle growth, and then still human values disappear. However, I care enough about some sort of humanity surviving that where I want to spend my next few years at least is trying to flesh out if there is possibly any third way that we could reasonably hope to execute without ending up in one of these horrible dystopias.
And before we go to AI, the one last question is, could you just give us an example or two of what would represent these kind of values that you would be willing to take this chance of creating this, very risky control and destruction of ordinary human culture in order to preserve that? Do you have some examples of these things that you value so highly?
Yeah, so this is sounds very naive and parochial, but I have like a bunch of kids, and I would really like to see something that looks like grandkids and my kids getting to have a similar experience that I had of, growing up, facing the world, developing, and then having kids and continuing that. So
the process of raising children and being a child that's raised, that's the experience that you want to be maintained, that you fear might be lost.
Yeah, and being a parent, yes.
Can I ask about this? Because it's I guess I just find it a bit alien, the thought of locking in our values. Like, of course, we see our values as good, because otherwise we wouldn't value the world through them. They're like a lens through which we see what's, good and bad. But I guess I see a lot of room for improvement. I see a lot of room for improvement with parenting. Like, I feel like as a parent, I mostly don't know what I'm doing, and I'm not doing a great job. I'm not doing a worse job than the people around me. No one's doing a very good job because no one really knows what they're doing. And I'd really like the future parenting to be radically different from the way it is now, like way, way, way better. That's the world I would like. And I feel that way about just about every value. I just think, well, there's just a huge amount of room for improvement. I'm not really able to imagine it. And it would be a total catastrophe to lock in the situation we have now, which basically sucks compared to how it could be. So what do you, is it that you just see a lower ceiling than I do? You're like, pretty much we've got it. Yeah.
No, so I think we agree. And I think you're conflating locking in values and locking in the situation. And I agree there are tons and tons of problems with the current situation, such as child abuse and even many other things we do wrong. And so, but I think you agree when you say we want the future to be better. I think we both do, but according to our current values. I mean, almost by definition. So if in the future we came to, I don't know, think child abuse was good or fine, you would probably say, no, that's not better. That's not what I wanted. So I guess I'm trying to say there's a really hard task of specifying our values at a level of abstraction that allows growth and change, or at least let's say improvement, without losing the fundamental goodness. And this might be impossible. Our goals might be so incoherent that this is just ill-specified task, but sort of saying almost by definition, this is what I want.
So then it sounds like it's worth asking you to go a little more detail. What do you value about parenting that you want to keep, even if you're willing to allow the experience and practice of parenting to change? Could you describe a value of parenting?
Yeah, great point. So I guess I would say my own personal growth and sort of realizing that I can level up and have these abilities that I didn't ever get to express before. My children leveling up, me getting to sort of be a bigger part of the future, right? Maybe gaining long-term influence. There's a lot of, I guess, I would say base level values of it just makes me happy when my kid is I love you, Dad, or whatever. And, it's why do you love eating? It's I just really love the sensation. So at some point we're sort of bottoming out and just these are things that I value, period. And I don't know if I can abstract most of them.
So let me offer one more distinction here. Many of the changes that happened in the past, we can understand as functional innovations that we expect to continue because something was invented that will just retain value for a long time, like eyes. There was a time before eyes. Now we have eyes. We don't think eyes are going away. They might be in different forms. or even law, say, or markets. Like there are things that once never existed. Now they exist, but we think they will just keep going. And leveling up sounds a lot like one of those things. Like it's just really hard to imagine things being born and growing in a complex world that wouldn't level up. So I would argue that you shouldn't worry about those sort of things going away. You should worry maybe about other more context-dependent things. So could you give us an example of a other more context-dependent thing that's the thing you're more reasonably worried about going away?
Yeah, okay. First of all, I want to say your point is well taken, that it's funny to be like enjoying or valuing growth in the small, but then somehow being troubled by growth in the large. It just seems like a real inconsistency there. I mean, I guess, again, just because I'm like a simple animal, like even just the physicality of like, let's say hugs, right? And you might say, okay, well, we can simulate hugs. That'll be like way better. And I agree. But that's just like maybe, okay, so I guess you're trying to say anything that I can point to as like a specific thing that I like, you'll say, well, we can probably do it better if we sort of, again, have more.
But we might not be inclined to. So an example you might give me is children giggling. My wife told me that recently the best sound in the world is a child giggling. And you might think children will be happy and they'll grow, but for some reason they won't giggle.
Sure.
And that would be a specific thing you think might go away.
Yeah.
And you want a future where we make sure children giggle. And if culture would make that otherwise change, we got to stop that, because children giggling is a thing you want to make sure happens.
Yeah, I think it's a good example.
Yeah. So I think that we weren't agreeing about the value versus the situation. That is, the example you gave is like, okay, child abuse is bad, right? And so we want a future where that doesn't happen. That's not what I was imagining. So if you compare us to, Robin and I are reading this book about peasants in France in like the 18th, 19th century. And like, the way they treat their kids, we would call that child abuse. They're a bit expendable. They put them to work at a really young age. A whole bunch of stuff about the way that maybe they don't even like they're giggling that much, let's say. And so I'm imagining a future that stands to us in our parenting the way we stand to those peasants. Namely, they would say what they were doing with their kids was child abuse. That is, their kids were like trying to grow and develop, but they were barely helping them. And they were kind of just letting the kids doing what they want without even realizing what human potential was. That was like a pathetic excuse for parenting, what the people did back then in 2020. That's the future I want. And so it's not just a future in which my values are realized and the things that I already know are a mistake, like child abuse, don't happen. It's really a future where they have different values, just as we have different values from these French peasants.
I guess I would challenge you and say, if you're comfortable with our values changing arbitrarily, then I feel like it just basically doesn't matter what we do, because it's just saying like, okay, whatever people value in the future, that's what they value. And like, I might as well just give up, or, if you're willing to sort of hand over the reins to someone else, no matter where they're going to steer, I guess that to me seems the same as almost having no values.
I mean, I guess the difference is whether you think improvement, like whether you sort of trust the future to make things better. So like the peasants handed things over to us, and I think we did a good job. And we should approach our descendants the same way that the peasants should have approached us, regardless of whether they would have.
Well, I think this is the case of the victors writing the history books. Like, of course we like our values, right? Like that's just like what we care about. So of course we did a good job, separating the future from everyone before us by our own standards. But I think Robin would say, let's, again, by our current standards, that's maybe not likely to change, or that's not likely to be the case for a lot of our things that we consider values today. So I guess I would say, again, if you just think that the future is going to do fine with the world no matter what, then I guess it doesn't really matter what we say today, because we've already won.
But so again, we could factor change into two buckets. We could say one bucket of change is admirable and understandable, and we would endorse after the fact looking at it. That's innovation, like I talked about with markets and law and eyes, right? If our ancestors didn't have eyes and they see us with eyes, they'll go, cool, that's great, glad you have eyes. And then another bucket of change is this other kind that happens somewhat randomly in your view, and therefore wherever it goes, you don't endorse, and you didn't want that kind of change. And I think Agnes is doubting how much there is of the second kind of change. Maybe more concrete examples would help, but I guess we all agree the first kind is fine. But the question is, how much is there of the second kind change that just wouldn't be the sort we would endorse if we knew about it, even on reflection, even fully understanding it? How much possibility is there for our descendants to just be different in that way, such that, for example, our ancestors who understood us fully would still reject some of our changes and just say, no, that was just wrong.
Yeah, and I agree with you that that the sort of empirical question that I think we need to work out, because I think I agree with you that our choices have a mostly competitive, uncontrolled future that has some potential for this kind of accidental change, or maybe it's predictable, but we're not necessarily endorsing it. Or take a gamble on the singleton to enforce like our current values, which again, maybe we already think that has like a 90% chance of being some horrible, sort of Soviet dystopia forever.
If you accept these two buckets, I might ask, like, your importance of these buckets might be a parameter, say between, 0 and 1. I might say, if 90% of the stuff I value is in the first bucket and 10% is in the second bucket, then a future where that 10% just goes off into random directions, I might think that's okay, because, hey, 90% in the first bucket, and I care a lot about that first bucket. That's what it means to put 90% on it. And so I think if I allow the past processes to continue, I'm going to get a full exploitation of that first bucket in all ways possible. And if we try to constrain things to limit that second bucket, because you don't want that to happen, I'm worried about that stopping the first bucket. Somehow we're not going to get all the good agreed on change because you're so obsessed with them differing with you about children giggling. And I go,
right.
So how important could it be for children to giggle, for God's sake, as opposed to our civilization figuring out how to parent well, going to the stars, taking over the universe, having immortality, figuring out the truth of goodness, Can't you give up on the child giggling bit? I mean, how important could that be?
Yeah. Oh, and I think maybe a good example of the second kind of change would be like language evolution, right? And you could say like, oh, there's like the French institution that tries to keep language the same, but it's actually really useful and enriching for us to like let it evolve, and it does alienate us from our past and even our older generations. Yeah. Okay. So I mean, when you put it that way, if those are our two choices, I think I would probably bet on growth and sort of like let it rip. I still think it's worthwhile spending a lot of time thinking about if there is anything in between. And I think you might reasonably warn that, well, that's going to be used as a license by the singleton wanters to build their horrible singleton, which I also agree that that's like a real danger.
Okay, but if the choice is between letting some 1% of world budget be dedicated to your research to try to find these better forms of mind control that if we find them we'll use, but still letting things rip, but until you find something, or locking down change and saying nope, no change until we figure this research thing out, your choice then would be.
I think it would be the 1% thing. However, I think we disagree on the situation, because this alignment thing, I think this research has to be done anyways, right? And we see this right now with like OpenAI kind of conflating the sort of alignment in the small of like do what the user asks you to do in this session, and alignment in the large, which is like care about humanity and our really important values. So I agree that like maybe the one is easy and one is nearly impossible, but I guess I would say that we are going to have to spend a lot of time like aligning AIs in some way, and so we do de facto have to make these choices about mind control already. So I want to spend a lot of time thinking about it, or even more time thinking about it than the market would incentivize.
Well, there's needing to spend a lot of time, and whether the market would incentivize it enough, that's a separate question. You might say, like, if parents care enough about their children sharing their values, they might be willing to pay a lot for some technology to let them do that, and the market might therefore invest a lot in that sort of technology in order to sell it to those parents who are so eager to make sure their children still giggle.
Yes, but I think there's likely to be a tragedy of the commons where, like, for instance, I want my kids to have meaningful jobs, like maybe something like that. And I think we both agree that, if we let AIs compete, then at some point, normal-ish humans just won't be able to. And so even if every individual parent wants their kids to have meaningful jobs, competition will mean that humans are outcompeted.
So I'll plant a flag that we may come back to the subject of whether there's a market failure, whether there's insufficient effort going there. But I guess I feel like we should probably now, since we put off AI so long, ask about AI relative to the scenario we just outlined in your priorities with respect to human descendants and how they would differ in their values. Is the situation with AI substantially different, or is it really just the same problem, adding in some new kinds of descendants?
So I agree with you. I think you didn't say, you asked. Okay, I think it's similar in some ways, and we could have imagined coming up with like really intense constitutional governments that are so dedicated to avoiding change that, and like they could have been successful. And I think ancient Sparta is an example of a civilization that did actually have a polity, like a government that successfully stopped change, and then it was sort of very powerful for a while, and then gradually got irrelevant and outcompeted, and then went away. So I guess I'll say I think that technology existed before, but the thing that's new is the potential to have much more control over the sort of constitution and make it more permanent, and also pair it with this massive growth and wealth generation that we expect AGI to give us in the near future.
So let's distinguish, is the AI version of this problem a worse problem? And that's a separate question from, do we have better tools to solve this problem with AI compared to with humans? And it seems like you were addressing that second question.
That's a great point. I guess I would say it's only worse in the sense that it's going to happen faster, but otherwise I think it's analogous.
Okay, so the actual AI problem is the same sort of problem, except it might happen faster. But then if that's a bigger problem because it's faster, then that's what you might have wanted to do for humans even without AI. You might have said, what we need to do is slow this down.
Exactly. I might have been the guy, like lots of religions have, tried to say, we're going to have these traditions and we're writing them down in a book. And then, thousands of years later, people are still doing those traditions. And again, you might say, well, that's has all sorts of downsides. But I think I would still want to do something like that. But obviously in a way that doesn't, if possible, interfere with the actual like a bunch of other values and growth. So again, I'm not totally convinced that it's even possible to have best of both worlds, but that's, again, what I want us to spend our brain power on.
So summarizing so far, you have this problem that some of our changes are changes you don't like, even though you might agree most are changes you do like. That human descendants and AI descendants both have this issue that that part might go directions you don't like. One thing that accentuates that problem in both cases is change happening more rapidly. So you might be tempted to slow down change. You might be tempted to institute stronger mind control. You want more budget to go into trying to find mind control solutions. And there's this last claim that it might be easier to have effective, useful mind control for AI relative to humans. So what's the basis for that claim?
I guess I would say it's easier to do like brain surgery on an AI in the sense that we can, copy states, examine this, the state in perfect detail, right? Doing neuroscience on a machine is just so much, it's equivalent to doing neuroscience on a human if we could copy them, had perfect atomic microscopes that could look at every single neuron firing it in a person's entire life, and then do randomized controlled trials where we just like edit, out one tiny bit at a time. So that's the reason I think it's easier.
So I'm sure you're aware of this possibility of brain emulations of humans. They would, by definition, be transparent and editable. Then do you think there's similar prospects for brain emulation mind control as AI mind control?
Yes.
And you'd be similarly tempted to want to impose mind control on them?
I think so. There might be some like values I have about mind controlling humans being more distasteful to me than machines, but I like, let's say at a first pass, about equally distasteful.
I guess I'm surprised, but I sort of thought that when you were saying that it was easier to modify the AIs, that's partly because coercion is less of an issue. That is, you're not as worried about coercing them as you are with humans. But maybe that's not right if you want to.
That's also true. Although I think that will change, and at some point we will probably have minds that, some of us might feel are so rich enough that we don't want to just give them pain. But I think that's also true that I'm much happier to do surgery on a machine brain than a human brain, because I don't want to coerce them or punish them or give them, pain.
So some people I've talked to at this point would claim that AIs are more modifiable because in some sense they're simpler. They have a more transparent architecture, a simpler design or something. And then some people would say, well, they just expect AIs to be more different than human descendants would be. And that's why they're more afraid of them, and then also more willing to constrain them. But that's not your position here.
I would say the second thing I agree with to some extent. And I, just like I don't care as much about non-human primates as I do humans, I don't expect I'll care as much about human or AIs, although I do expect to interact with some very charming AIs in the future that will make me less like speciesist. But
Agnes, do you have a useful intervention here?
I guess I have a question for Robin, which is, say we're not talking about stopping change. Say we're just talking about slowing it down. What's so bad about that?
I'm not sure you have a knob calibrated in those units. I think at the moment we have rapid change. We are at the moment sort of area by area limiting change, in terms of, say, genetic engineering or nuclear energy or other sorts of things. And we are still growing. But I think if you just make sure, as long as we're still growing, it's okay to slow things down more, you might reach a point where things slow down to zero and you go, I need to back off, and that doesn't work. You may not really have a sense of what exactly you're controlling, what the effect is. There may be long lags. So for example, at the moment, like say China had a one-child policy to limit fertility growth and population growth. And then they decided recently, we stamped down on it too hard, time to let off the brakes, and okay, people go wild, have more kids, and they don't. That is, there's a lot of inertia in all the social changes they caused through their one-child policy. And it's not obvious that they will in a very long time manage to, regain net growth from fertility in population. So I think it's not clear whether your constraints are actually allowing positive growth or not. It won't be clear for a while. And by the time it is clear, it may be somewhat too late for many of your issues.
I see. That seems like a very hard thing to predict one way or the other.
Yes. So that means, in essence, there's a probability distribution over whether we will continue to grow. And every time you regulate another thing and limit another kind of change, I have to say you're just adding to the probability that we won't grow. That's how I think you should think of your choice. That's the choice you're making. You're making more controlled growth in the scenarios where you do grow, but a few smaller fraction of the time are you growing.
Right. So now it just sort of seems to me like, well, there's some kind of a trade-off between how much control we have and how much growing we're going to do. And kind of everyone agrees that we should do some growing, and everyone agrees that we should have some control. And then the question is just like where to make that trade-off. Does that sum up your guys' disagreement?
I'm not sure we disagree about this point, actually. I think that controlling growth is very blunt instrument and dangerous. I think recently there have been a few knobs that look kind of tempting, like stopping the training of the very large language models. But I totally agree with Robin that, every time you do like a windfall tax or like some big intervention like this, people will anticipate that it's going to happen the next time, and then they might just not invest. Or there's all sorts of, unforeseen second order effects. So I think we agree that it's like a very blunt instrument and potentially extremely destructive every time we try to control or slow growth.
But you do think that some amount of slowing growth is worth it in order to get more control over the descendants being similar to us, right?
I suspect that's the case. I'm not sure. And I mean, I think if we think controlling growth is worthwhile, it's because we expect it to be paired with, let's say, upgrading our institutions, like our sense-making institutions, the decision-making institutions, like, using prediction markets more or something like that. If we don't think that that sort of thing is going to happen in the meantime, then I agree we're just kind of hitting ourselves on the head. And, it's like the people who said, like, why are we going to space when we haven't solved poverty? It's like, well, we're not going to solve poverty even if we don't go to space. But again, I think that the default features are probably pretty bad from my point of view. I'm not certain about this. So I really want to spend a bunch of time trying to, again, think about whether there are ways that we could do some controlling of the growth as in a way that we expect would actually help. But I agree that naively just saying, putting our foot on the brakes is a very dangerous and probably just destructive move.
But Robin, you agree that some controls are appropriate, right? Like in one of your conversations, you said a form of regulation you might support is that these training runs should have to be done in specially secure facilities where that presumably would cost more money or whatever. Like that's a form of intervention that you at least tentatively were saying you might support, right?
It seemed relatively low cost. In particular, I was saying secure operating systems.
Okay, so
kind of facility.
My point is that, like, at the meta level, it seems to me that you, Robin, also agree that with David that some growth costs are worth it for getting control.
So a lot of debates end up of this form. You define a spectrum, you define two extremes, and then you notice neither of us want to go all the way to either extreme. And then you say, okay, we're done, we agree. And you go, no, not quite. So what I want to do is more identify the factors that would push you in one direction or another on this axis to get a handle on moving yourself on the axis. That is, I want to find analysis frameworks that will give us some bearing on this. And so one of my analysis frameworks that you may have read or heard is this idea of fertile and infertile factions. That's a way to think about which of these changes you want to embrace and, protect, defend your side of some axis, and for which of them you're going to go, I don't care so much, let it go. So this is, I think a lot of people are just going on a very basic intuition, which is, I imagine a thing, I imagine how different it feels for me, and I go, the more different it feels for me, the more I go, I don't like that. I want to stay over here on my end of the spectrum. That, I think, is just the core emotional intuition going on here. And I want you to reflect on that and notice that maybe on reflection, some of those differences you shouldn't care so much about, and others you should. That's how I want to push you. And one way to do that is to ask you to reflect on which of these factions would evolution, cultural or genetic, induce you to favor, and which of them would it not? That is, you might realize you have this, yay us, boo them intuition, in part because evolution supports that and selects for it for some kinds of us versus them, but not for all kinds of us versus them. And I would argue that the us versus AI is not one of those kinds that evolution would select for. And therefore, it's not something that on reflection you should so strongly endorse.
Can I just ask a question?
Please.
Sorry, I didn't interrupt.
No.
Just a question about that, about how we can tell whether a faction is fertile or not. So I believe one of the examples you gave of an infertile faction was like identification with one's gender.
Right?
But how do we know evolution wouldn't favor that? That is, maybe it sort of turns out that when people, women bond with other women and men bond with other men, and they feel a bit of antipathy towards each other, that we reproduce more in that situation.
So the argument is about the simplest form of selection. You could always make more complicated models where in some version of them you would get selection in one direction and others you get selection in the other direction. But if I average over those, I might get typically the simpler model. So just to make sure our listeners are up to date here, the idea is, for example, for gender, that we're in this evolutionary equilibrium where if like there are substantially more males than females and males mate with females, then you just get more genetic bang by putting your genes into females because it's moved away from 50-50. So there's this strong evolutionary pressure for your genes to be a package that's equally valuable as a male or a female because that mixture is set. So you might happen to have a set of genes that's just, they go better in females than in males, but then there'll be some other package of genes that goes better in males than females. Some subgroup could happen to it. For them, it could be true that it's a fertile faction for them to favor the gender, but then there would be some other genes that for whom it would be a fertile faction to favor the opposite gender. And both of these genes will show up in both genders an equal amount of the time with standard genetic, male-female mating. So, but rather than get into the details, I mean, I mainly wanted to if you buy into this idea that there are fertile factions and you see some examples, then you might be able to ask, is this us versus AI a fertile faction? So my favorite example of a fertile faction would be a generation, like favoring your generation over the next generation. That can't plausibly favor
infertile faction.
Right. That's an infertile faction. Right. I'm sorry. That can't plausibly promote your genes or memes. So you should, even if you have the intuition that next generation, they feel different from me, and I want to promote my generation over them, you got to realize that on net, natural selection isn't going to favor that kind of a favoritism. And then, the next analogy closest to AI would be, imagine space descendants versus Earth descendants. So we're all here on Earth, and there's this axis of Earth people versus space people. And you could see, I favor Earth people over space people. And you could think, if we let people leave Earth, there'll be these space people, and they'll come to dominate Earth people because there's a lot more space than Earth. And that would be bad for my side of the faction because I'm an Earth people. So the way that we Earth people can win is to prevent anybody from leaving Earth. And then, ta-da, we Earth people will win over the space people. Yay us. And you can see how evolution isn't going to favor that. Evolution is going to favor lineage expanding into all the resources available to it, which means expanding out into space. So that's a relatively close analog, because I would say AI is basically about expanding out into mind space. We are now in a corner of mind space where the humans are occupying. There's this vast territory of mind space we could expand out into. And as we expand out, we will take with us many features of us that we value.
Okay, great. So I think we're getting to the part that I wanted to talk about, which is the taking parts that we value. So, I mean, I think here's a Dr. I agree with you that the beings that favor becoming more fertile will dominate. With the caveat that I might decide that some amount of change means that I'm no longer me, right? So if you say, hey, step into this blender and we're going to use your iron to make a von Neumann probe, and then that's going to be like a very fertile faction, aren't you happy to be part of the future? I would say, that's not me, that's the von Neumann probe. So I think what I really want to talk about is, okay, how can we engineer legacies, right? Can we make these von Neumann probes say, okay, on every planet, you're going to have a little human colony, and it's going to be a little Potemkin village or something like that. And I think that sounds really silly and naive. I don't think my thinking along these lines is very sophisticated, but I think that this knob of how much legacy we are giving to the replicators is a really important one. And I don't accept sort of that zero control over it is an equilibrium we should accept without really trying to push on that frontier.
So let me sketch what I would think as a default AI future and ask if you disagree. I would say the default AI future is, in the near term, for-profit firms on Earth make AIs for human customers to sit in human-like roles. And for those purposes, they will be evolved to look much like humans, to act much like humans, and to have, at least on the surface in their behavior, relatively human values. And then over time, they will become a larger fraction of the economy. Then at some point, they will dominate the economy. And then from that point forward, their value changes will more be dominated by the internal processes within that community rather than the external pressures from humans and customers are what they want. But that meant we will have endowed them initially with a lot of us. And when they go out into the universe, when they meet other alien AI from other civilizations, they will be more like us than those other AIs.
Yeah.
So they will take a lot of us out there in that default future, right?
Right. And now I'm going to say, okay, but I bet you would also agree that there might be some cheap interventions we can do. Like in your talk with Katja Grace, you were saying we maybe want to add some like consciousness having modules if they're cheap. And I would say we also want to add some like, let's say like we really want them to respect the Sabbath or something. It's like a silly example, right? Like let's say, okay, they're going to have like 1 micro Sabbath per century.
Yeah, but I don't want a silly example. I want an example you actually believe in. Like we talk about the children giggling. Is that an example you believe in? AI children need to giggle.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Let's say AI children need to giggle. So are there cheap interventions that we can expect would increase our legacy, our degree of humanness of these AGI descendants?
And now, of course, they could giggle in a surface sort of way that wasn't the right sort of giggling.
Yep.
And the question is, how deep are you going to have to go into them to make them have the right sort of giggling for the right sort of reasons?
Yeah.
Just like our ancestors might have said, well, sure, you go to church and you say mass, but like you're not really doing it the right way. Not
exactly.
The right sort of reasons the way we did.
Right. And this is what like the alignment problem is, right? Like how do we make them actually care about the things that we like in our deepest senses would? And I agree that might be able to find.
But you know that there may not be these deepest things. So
exactly.
So for example, like there's this literature on authenticity, and people want to be their authentic selves, and they resent, say, social pressure making them their inauthentic selves. But when you probe for what is their authentic selves, it just turns out to be whatever is more socially admired.
Yes,
that's what they consider their authentic self. Yeah. So there really isn't this deep self that they're preserving. They are actually trying to present an image of a deep self, which is equal to whatever they want to present.
So I agree that my values are incoherent and like maybe not deep in many senses, but I still have some preferences over the far future, I guess is the claim I want to defend.
Can I just go back and ask about, I think I still don't understand why the gender-based preferences are necessarily infertile. And let me go to the other example you gave, the generational preference, right? So the preference for my generation over the next generation. So just historically, every culture I have ever heard of or read about has had this preference. It's like pretty much universal. And not only that, but it's like, it's always like the one right before us, they were better. Like it goes back to Hesiod. There's like the golden age, and it's just been going downhill. And so it looks like a very fertile preference in the sense that when you look at actual human societies that where they say these kids these days don't measure up to my generation, that works out in the long run. Now, we may not exactly understand how it works out, right? And you're sort of saying like, well, it doesn't really make sense, but sort of empirically it works out. And the same thing could be true of gender preference. It just could be that in societies where there's like gender conflicts that come from identifying with your gender, those people reproduce more. And so I still feel like I'm not sure I see that it seems like an empirical question, which factions are fertile or not. And we may not be able to know by reasoning. And maybe the best guesses are just look historically, which factions have been fertile.
I think you're talking about which factions are energizing. We could just say which factions engage people and which factions do they coordinate around. And that concept, I agree, people do coordinate around generations. So setting aside evolution just as a general social fact, a standard feature of societies that we economists analyze is just the tendency to form coalitions. Democracy promotes this, but many other kinds of worlds do, where basically you want to join a majority group that's going to dump on a minority. And people are always looking around for what majority group they could join that will join together to dump on a minority and gain an advantage that way. And for that purpose, almost any group will do. But you're especially going to be looking for groups that you hang around a lot, where you can observe them better to see if they're going to stay with this coordination. Basically, are you guys, because there's always a bunch of competing coalitions at the same time. That's a key feature of political theory, et cetera. It's, this coalition battle is unstable in the sense that whenever you've got a coalition that's going to beat on a minority, there's always a way to tempt a majority of that coalition off to a different coalition that gets even more advantages. And that's just an endless loop. Like it's just a fundamentally hard to get everybody around one coalition and get them to resist all the other coalitions they could possibly join to favor a different majority over a different minority. And so in that battle for coalitions, which comes to the dominance, a big factor is just going to be, can we like see each other, see that each other are like devoted to this coalition, monitor us for betrayal of the coalition, those sorts of things. That's going to be a big causal part in which coalitions actually form. That's just a different effect. I'm going to call that energizing. Coalitions that can actually form and successfully beat on the alternative will be a coalition that exists and happens, but that's different than whether it's promoting its genes or memes. That's an evolutionary promotion concept, and that's what I meant by fertile.
But wouldn't you think that the more energized coalitions are going to be more likely to promote themselves?
They would be more likely to form and dump on the minority, but that doesn't mean they actually promote their genes. That's the point. Those are different actions.
Okay.
Speaking of actions, I kind of want to bring this conversation to a more concrete decision that I have to make, right? So I'm like a machine learning researcher. And so right now my main choice is, well, I can stay in academia. I could go to, let's say, OpenAI and make big bucks, ushering in this new age of growth, or, who knows, like in expectation, who knows? Or I could, try to do some sort of more activisty kind of thing about like engineering some sort of governance. And from my point of view, the OpenAI route seems like, okay, great, I'll get rich. That'll give me more local control over the world and like help my kids more. But in the long run, I won't be able to have much influence on like the AI that we build because it's going to be constrained by competition. So
I disagree. So
okay.
I disagree right there.
Great.
Right. So say in the AI world, just like with human descendants, there'll be a competition between autarky and democracy, right? Democracy and some other kinds of government, right? And that's one of the kind of factions you feel an alliance toward. I don't know which, I'm not going to ask you, but it stands in for dozens of other factions on which you might be taking a side.
Sure.
Right? You might like be Star Trek versus Star Wars. You're just really into Star Trek, and your mission in life is to make sure the aliens love Star Trek. Your descendants love Star Trek more than Star Wars, right? And all the AIs do, right? So the point is, you're part of a number of factions like that. And the future of AIs, they will take side on those things. They will take sides on Star Trek versus Star Wars. They will take sides on democracy versus autarky. And by getting rich today, working for OpenAI, you will be able to influence which of those factions have more, dominate in the future. You will be able to allocate your extra resources and time from your winning at this career game to promote many other factions if you are willing to side with the AI, right? So that is, because that's like, if you were thinking about leaving Earth versus not with the, Earth versus space faction, you'd realize if you leave Earth, you're going to be a much bigger economy out there, and you'll be able to influence a much part of it, and you'll be able to use all your greater wealth in space to promote all the other things you cared about. That's the direct analogy there.
Okay, great. So I think I disagree, because my fear is that, yes, in the short term, I could influence like these decisions, but in the long term, if we allow competition to like let it rip, that Star Trek versus Star Wars, it just won't matter anymore, right? And the eyes won't care. They won't care about basically all the things that we care about won't really matter at all anymore. And so the only chance that I have is to maintain something like the status quo.
So I think that's a misconception about competition, or at least let me argue that and let's go there. So as you may know, Marx and Engels, founders, writers of the Communist Manifesto, they argued explicitly that the natural thing with capitalism was going to have competition was going to lead to one capitalist firm who ruled the world, right? And many people have just thought that competition just converges to a uniformity and leaves no room for variation or legacies. And many people theoretically think that even about AI. They claim that AI competition would lead to the one AI, a single kind of AI. The universe would be filled with the one AI. They're all the same. They all do exactly the same thing. They all think exactly the same, because they think that's the natural endpoint of competition. Biologically on Earth, you can see very clearly that biological competition has led to increasing variety, increasing diversity and complexity. And similarly, competition within the human economy has led to increasing diversity and variety and complexity. And I think we have many ways to understand that. And so it's just wrong to think that a vast world of AIs spreading into the universe with big complicated minds and economies and ways they could interact would all converge to some simplicity that destroys all legacies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess I agree with you that there is a degree to which legacies preserve even under competition. But I guess I would think about, like, in very competitive markets, we do tend to see convergence. Like, big corporations tend to look very similar. Products tend to become more similar. Even religions, I think, become more similar as they grow.
But remember, we had this distinction between like functional innovation and other stuff, right?
Yeah.
So the functional innovation you should expect to converge and you should want to converge, right? It's the other stuff that you might want legacies in, and that's the stuff where competition doesn't necessarily take it all away.
Okay, so I there was one thing you said, which is that you should want to converge on the functional stuff. And I guess I was saying, I think there might be some stuff that I just care about that is not functional, like the Cathars who thought we shouldn't have kids, right? Like, there's no way that they are going to like dominate the future, but that's just what they cared about. And if you tell them that's not really your value, I think they would just disagree,
So I've come across this a lot before. So many people think many of the things that humans have that they value aren't competitive, aren't functional. So laughter, love, play, art, music, parties. Many people think that much of the thing they most value, those aren't functional, and competition would take them away. And we social scientists and evolutionary biologists, et cetera, we have a lot of ways we understand these things are functional. They exist because they are functional. They weren't just random accidents of evolution. They are here for a reason.
No, I totally agree with you that, competition did give us all the things that we value and all the art and life and stuff. I guess I would concede that, like, let's say like 95% of the stuff that we might consider like artsy or superfluous is actually valuable and useful. And I guess I'm saying, well, whatever the size of the difference is, I'm willing to say that I think there are things that I value that are just bad for my own competitiveness. And you might say, well, like, that's just something you have to give up, or you're going to be left to this stuff.
But what fraction of the stuff you value is of that sort? That's the key question.
Okay.
If it's 95, then yeah, we got to focus on it. If it's 5, maybe you should just accept it's going to go away.
Okay.
If have a farewell party,
funeral,
and be done with it.
Yeah. So I think that question and the possibility for cheap legacy building, I think, are the two. I agree with you. I think what I'm introducing here that I haven't seen you talk much about before is like, what are our scope for cheap legacy building or like legacy increasing? Because that's the thing that I want to explore.
Okay, so let's talk about some legacies.
Sure.
One kind of thing. So on Earth, for example, cities are in particular locations. And once upon a time, that made functional sense. And later on, they're just stuck there. They don't move very easy, right? And so city locations are a legacy. Similarly with, say, programming languages or human languages, languages are a legacy, right? There's these coordination on languages, as you know, as a computer scientist. There are many technical standards that we coordinate on, and that they end up being legacies just because once enough people are using them, then they kind of get stuck. Do those sound like legacies that you?
Okay, so that's great. I totally agree that there's a lot of worthless legacy, and most of the legacies we have are kind of like worthless or accidental in that sense. But again, I think that
can children giggling be that sort of a legacy? That is, could it just be that when enough children giggle, enough poems are written about it, they're included in enough heartwarming stories, they're told in enough, biographies, that the society collects the idea that they're valuable, and then that gets entrenched, and then because of the same sort of network effects as programming languages, the world continues to have children who giggle because at one point they were seen as valuable, and then they just keep going.
Well, exactly. So I think that's the question: is how do we maintain those things, like whatever the like valuable, but valuable to me, but not growth promoting parts of this like payload that I want to preserve? How do I actually make sure that the future cares about it? Because there's a ton of like old traditions and stuff that we just let die because they're not functional and we don't value them anymore.
So like when people choose their family religion or holidays or other sorts of things, people are often making choice. What about the past do I want to preserve and pass on?
Yep.
And we're all constantly making those choices. Is it okay if we keep making those, or do you want to make sure we make those choices in the future the way you want us to do now?
The second one, yes. And I know that sounds like a recipe for disaster and it sounds horrible and totalitarian, but I guess I'm saying I do think that there is some stuff that if I could, without destroying the world, do that.
Like, for example, go ahead, please.
Let's take holidays, right? So there's your kids will grow up having celebrated some holidays and with certain family traditions, and with their own kids, they will do some of those things, but not others, right? Just like you and your parents. And so do you wish that you lived in a world where you got to select which ones they did and
Yes.
which ones?
Yes. And I mean, I might disagree with like what holidays were chosen before because my values have drifted. But that doesn't mean that my ancestors were wrong to like try to get me to do some holidays from their point of view that I think are stupid.
Well, let's go down the list. What about favorite dishes that your family made? Do you want to make sure your children and grandchildren cook those same favorite dishes? Favorite movies?
Great example. Yeah,
you want them to watch the same movies?
Sure. Yes, good examples. Yeah, those are things that I would, all else being equal, I would like it if some tiny fraction of their lives they revisited these things that I happen to value today arbitrarily.
But my question was, like, they're going to revisit some but not others of the things that you like. Say the favorite dishes. They're not going to eat every single one of those dishes every day or whatever. They're gonna some of them are not gonna stick with them, and then others of them are. And you wish you could pick that it's the fried chicken rather than lasagna that will stick with them or something.
Yeah, well, I'm just saying there's going to be some that they'll do because they're functional, no matter what. And then there's going to be the rest, there's the other pile that are not functional and will just hurt their growth to do. So
right.
Avoid. And I'm saying I want to be able to put some things on that list. Yes.
But and you want to choose which things go on that list is my point.
Exactly. Yes.
Compared to what they would choose for themselves. So as she says, they're going to choose some things.
Well,
but you want to make sure they do more than they would choose for themselves.
Well, what I want is for them to want the same things that I do. So again, I do think that I perceive maybe arbitrary difference between they loathe the holiday and they think it's bullshit and they are like miserable the whole time versus they just are born wanting to do the holiday and appreciating it in the similar ways that I did. The second thing is what I want.
But they are born partially because the way we raise them. You want them to be born even more strongly to want to preserve things than they otherwise would be in our world so far.
Exactly.
And that's true for dishes and for clothing styles and for music and for couches and for driving habits. Or like, how many things are we talking here?
It seems like that would verge into selecting their romantic partners too, because like, kind of romantic partners, that's going to strongly determine whether they go with, like, if you have religious traditions like I do, then if I were you, I would want to make sure that my child like had a romantic partner of, either at least open to my religion or of the same religion, so that the set of holidays, the religious holidays, will get preserved.
Yeah. So I think it does sound ridiculous to talk about caring about these minutiae of their experience. I don't want to give up. I want to try to thread the needle and find some way that's meaningful to me in which they have like preserved my non-functional values. And it might end up looking a little bit ridiculous, just like a lot of, ancient religious traditions today look pretty ridiculous. And I still am not willing to say that like 0 is optimal.
But you're still sure that what would happen without adding more control isn't enough. That's the key thing you're sure of.
I'm not sure about that, but I think it's likely that it's not optimal. Let's see.
And that you're willing to pay pretty high costs and take some pretty substantial chances to try to make it more.
So that's why I kept talking about cheap interventions, because I am not willing to take huge risks. And I do think that like these like singletons are like a horrible risk and one of the like worst outcomes of humanity. So basically I'm saying I'm not committed to doing it. At this stage, I'm trying to weigh the relative costs and benefits.
But so many people talk today as if we allow AIs to get much better than they are now, then the game is over and they're just going to go change the universe and we will hate that. And it's as if we were exterminated. So how close are you to that?
I'd say I'm pretty close. I'm not a big believer in
Well, so this is big, right? So you're a minute ago, you're talking about, I just want to look, I want a few more holidays and a few more dishes. It's not a big deal, only if it's cheap, you say. But with AI, you go, oh my God, this is Armageddon. We got to do everything possible in order to make sure. Otherwise, it's all over, right? So
right. I think the confusion was because you were talking about my descendants, and I was thinking about like something already pretty much like me. But I think you had already established that we could consider the AGI as our descendants. So,
right.
I was thinking from like an almost victory point of view, and you were thinking from the like default point of view, and I didn't clarify that. So yeah, I'm not sure, but I do think that AIs could be pretty alien, and I'm also not as relaxed as you are about them respecting property rights, or rather, I think even if they do, we will be like swindled out of our resources. And
how archaic are you with your descendants respecting property rights? Because again, that was the whole point of the structure. First, let's talk about what we expect without AI, and then with AI. So it sounded like even without AI, you think your descendants are going to get really different. Are you worried about them not respecting property rights too?
To some extent. I mean, like a good example would be like an old person on the internet who gets swindled out of all their savings by like someone of the younger generation, something that already happens. And I expect that to happen if we can't, let people like if we can't solve aging, basically.
Right, but for AI, you're willing to go with some pretty strong policy recommendations in order to prevent this Armageddon terrible scenario of the AIs displacing. Whereas with your human descendants, you agree that there's going to be some problems of that form, but you're not talking about the same level of policy response, right?
Okay, I guess I'll say I'm hoping that there could be cheap options. If there are none, I'm not yet willing to like say that I'm not going to hit the big button and have some more pervasive form of control. Like I'm not ruling out the singleton as like the best thing in expectations at this point.
I think we should wrap up because we're over an hour. So maybe each of you wants to have one last thing that you say.
I don't know. I really enjoy this, and I'm really glad that you guys are taking the time to think about these issues, because I think that we do have a chance to either go down like a horrible route or a great route, and it's not clear to me which one is which. I really appreciate that you've been trying to clarify these issues. I guess I would actually love to see from you in maybe a future essay a more direct rebuttal to what you think would go wrong with this plan for building like aligned AGI, which is what like a lot of the smart people that I know are trying to do. They're saying we're going to make the AI actually care about the same things that we do. I know that you've touched on these before.
It just sounds a lot like all the other mind control people have ever tried. I haven't seen the reason why this is a different sort. You say, yes, everybody really hates the previous examples of mind control for good reason.
Oh, but I don't think
it looks a lot like it.
I don't think they hate this. The really successful ones, like breeding dogs to.
I think dogs bred us more the other way around, right?
Okay, but again, that's a successful like mind control that both parties are sort of happy with, at least today.
So, thank you for discussing this with us, David. And I guess my conclusion is there's still more to talk about here.
Me too.
All right. Bye.
Hi, Agnes. Bye, Robin.